We are back. Welcome to the Leadership Launchpad Project. I'm Rob Kalwarowsky, and unfortunately, Susan's not with us today. She's out, but we have an incredible guest, the soul doctor himself, the host of the Dangerous Wisdom Show and consulting philosopher, Nikos Patedakis. Nikos, how are you?
I'm excellent, Rob. Thank you. And you're doing well. We checked in. It's nice. We're both in a good space.
Absolutely. And we always start to show off with a quote. So I have one from someone we're going to talk a little bit about today, from Carl Jung. And he says, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Nikos, what do you think?
Nice. Yeah, that's where you start to notice the shadow. And there's a formula, you could say, awareness plus repression or suppression equals insanity. If something is impacting the soul, but we are keeping it repressed or we're suppressing it, that means we kind of notice, but then we quickly push it down. Repression means you didn't even know you were doing it. It is unconscious. And the only way forward is to bring awareness to it. Awareness is the medicine we need. And part of that is integrating the shadow. And it's interesting then to think of all the things that we're irritated by right now, on both sides of the spectrum. And then to wonder, what does that say about our personal shadow and our collective shadow?
Ooh. So before we get into that, because I want to talk about the collective shadow as well, can you tell us just a little bit about you?
Sure. I'm a philosopher, which is a weird thing in this culture. And we should make a distinction if we can. Thoreau was really clear about it over 100 years ago when he was sitting on Walden Pond. And he said, well, there are nowadays professors of philosophy, but not philosophers. And that had been true for a long time by the time he said it. So then what I do doesn't really fit in the academy. It's why I left the academy. I mean, I went and got my union card because that's how you become a philosopher in this culture. That's the way you do it. But then you have to do more if you want to be more than a professor. And so had to do all that work too. But I'm a philosopher, and philosophy is just how we do things. And a philosopher is supposed to be a servant, an attendant. In ancient Greece, the dominant culture has these roots. It's tricky when we talk about that connection, but I'm trying to give you a sense of my lineage. It's lucky that I happen to be a first-generation American. My father was born in Crete. And so that is, the Greek philosophers are my lineage. And at the same time, we have less in common with those ancient Greek philosophers than we might with certain other people today. Somehow there's a connection. It's largely because of written things. Writing holds the dominant culture together in certain ways, but it's not like a person in New York City has that much in common with Socrates, in terms of the way their life feels and looks, and even what their cultural habits are. But still, it has influenced us. And back then, Plato and Socrates and others would have seen philosophy as therapeia, therapy for the soul. But therapeia means to attend. It's to be an attendant to the soul. Socrates saw himself as a midwife, that he was helping you give birth to yourself. And so I work in that vein, that philosophy is about our way of life. Philosophy is how we do things. Anything at all that you do, you can't do it without having a philosophy. So I can get away without becoming a CEO. But the CEO can't get away from philosophy, because they're going to have a philosophy of business, a philosophy of leadership, a philosophy of relationship. It's going to govern everything. Philosophy of parenting, if they've got kids, all of it. That's how we do things. And so my work as a consulting philosopher then is to bring the wisdom traditions to people's lives, show them that it is therapy, it is healing, transformative, inspiring, brings you insights that you couldn't otherwise have. And that we need it, because we don't want to live in accord with ignorance, but we don't have the resources of wisdom. It's not resourced in this culture, what is in the wisdom traditions. So I now live, my father came on a boat when he was a boy. It was the Queen Victoria, and he ended up eventually went from Greece to New York. over the ocean, then eventually ended up in California. And then my parents met. My father was my mother's dance teacher. He became a dancer. He didn't grow up that way, but he thought it seemed nice. And and then he met my mother. And then unfortunately they separated. And I spent most of my time with my life with my mother, a lot in the East Coast. I've lived in different parts of Turtle Island, the United States, North America, and I'm now back in California, where my father had been, but not where he was. I'm in the Maxareja, the Santa Cruz Mountains. The Cotoni people lived here, although where I live, maybe no indigenous people actually live because the fire risk is too intense here. Even if they did cultural burning, this is just a particularly hot place where I'm at. But they did live, there were indigenous people taking care of these lands, these very special lands. California is such a special place. So I'm lucky to be here for now. And this is where I work. I work over Zoom. It's an easy way to work with people. I also love to work with people in person because there are things you can do, experiences that you can create, initiatory experiences or transformative experiences of various kinds that are very powerful and empowering in person. And I think maybe that's a sketch. It's something people will find out more as we talk more about philosophy.
Yeah, I love it. And maybe I'd love to dig is just you got a mug with a horse on it, you're wearing a bandana with a horse on it, and you got some horses behind you. You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, there are spiritual and ecological. In the ecologies, we have this concept now of the keystone species, and this was done through careful work, and some of the early work was done by going to tide pools in Oregon, in the Pacific Northwest, Washington, Oregon, and just pulling organisms out. It's maybe I'm not sure how ethical that was, but you start pulling organisms out of the tide pools and see what happens to the tide pool. And the researcher found out that, well, you can pull out certain organisms and the thing will keep going. But if you pull out a starfish, the tide pool it collapses to just one or two species where it might have been a dozen or more. And since then, we've found these species in other places, famously in Yellowstone, this national park in the United States, in Turtle Island. There were wolves were eliminated. And when they brought the wolves back, it changed everything. Everything shifted. So it's not that the ecology was dead, but they are such a keystone species there. And that's what Leopold meant when he was writing about, Aldo Leopold, when he wrote about the thinking like a mountain, that he understood that if you think like a human, you don't know what a wolf is. You have to think like the larger ecology. And he didn't have the keystone species concept, but he saw that the wolf mattered to the mountain. And so there are also spiritual keystone species. Every being is important, but the earthworm doesn't have the same place in the soul that your butterfly has. Your butterfly is a spiritual keystone species. She is archetypally charged in a way that's not quite the same for the earthworm. We love the earthworm; she's wonderful, but the same thing goes with the horse. Donkeys are wonderful, but there's something about the horse that it has this special presence. I mean, I in fact want people to honor donkeys more than we do. We depend on them, and they've carried the human burden as much as the horse has, in some cases more. But the horse is one of those spiritual keystone species, and the horse is a medial figure. The butterfly is that image of the transformation. The horse is about the medial space, moving between these realms. How do we get from our ignorance to wisdom? How do we get from our stuckness, our imposter syndrome, our stress, our depression? How do we get from that to the liberation? Well, the horse can carry us. And so it just happens to be a very important spirit animal for me. So we have these beings that are spiritual keystone species, and they become part of the medicine of our life. They're there to help us and assist us. And as Claude Lévi-Strauss put, the reason those animals are venerated in cultures is not that they're good to eat, although once upon a time we did eat horses,
I've
but they're
eaten
good to
horse.
have you? Well, I mean, that's how it started. You know, they were a prey animal, and then they were the model of enslavement. Probably, I don't, sometimes think before we ever enslaved humans, I wonder if we enslaved horses first. And then that certainly ramped up our capacity to enslave because the horse is supposed to carry us to liberation, but we let it carry us to perdition. We let it fuel conquest. And that was spiritually ironic. It's precisely the opposite of what the horse was there for. But as Levi-Strauss said, we don't venerate these beings or relate with them, revere them because they're good to eat. We actually revere them because they're good to think. And even if it's a prey animal, it doesn't mean that it didn't teach us how to be human. Wolves taught us how to be human. Horses taught us how to be human. Birds taught us how to be human. We learned song and call and dance and dignity. Because if you see the dignity of these beings in the wild, you just naturally envy it. There was a philosopher who wrote a book called The Philosopher and the Wolf. He adopted a little wolf puppy. And what he confesses in there is that here he was, a philosopher, he's trained, he's more a professor, but I do love him. No disrespect to you, Mark Rollins. But there he was being a philosopher with that wolf, and he confesses that he just admired that wolf. He just wanted to be like that wolf, and it was really teaching him how to be a human being, how to be in this world. So that's what the horse is there for. And sometimes under the right conditions, I like to work with people who either have horses in their lives or are interested or drawn to them because they can be teachers. When I was working on my PhD dissertation, I announced to my dissertation committee, with all due respect, I said, look, I've been in the academy for a long time, starting from an undergraduate. I got 2 master's degrees in philosophy. That's how obsessed I was with learning it. And then a PhD. And I said, I learned more in 20 minutes from a formerly wild Mustang than I learned in all those years from at least the academic philosophers. And so there's something really powerful that they can teach you that's very difficult to understand, like psychedelics, that's the way that is too.
Yeah, and maybe let's go back to the shadow, right? And you sort of touched on it when you said that we used horses to basically conquer and do ethically debatable things. And I think a lot of that is related, obviously it's related to the shadow. So you want to just start us off with, like, what's your understanding of the shadow?
Yeah, sure. Well, let me say that with respect to Jung, that he saw himself as a philosopher. He said, really what we are is philosophic doctors. We're practicing philosophers. But he too said, no one would know that because what you see in the university isn't philosophy anymore, not like this. So he saw himself as an attendant of the soul in this way. And the spiritual traditions around the world, we did not discover the unconscious. Indigenous people on Turtle Island had a sense of the unconscious that was far more like Freud's than any sense of the psyche that the conquerors would have had when they first came over here. And so it's almost like they were more like us than today than we are like those ancestors of conquest. Well, I mean, I'm lucky. I'm Greek. Where we didn't do any of that, but I'm not innocent. I'm part of the dominant culture. I'm just so the Buddhist tradition is really, really exceptional as a philosophy that explains the mind quite comprehensively. There's no philosophical tradition that doesn't have psychology in it. Psyche means soul. So Socrates was intimately concerned with the soul. They were psychologists. But in the dominant culture, we don't really get that as a strong emphasis till Nietzsche. It gets lost. The Greeks understood it. Then Jung and Freud were influenced by Nietzsche and by the Greeks, and they resurrected. Okay, let's really talk about the soul. What is it? What is this mind that we think we know what it is? And they found, whoa, it's really it's much bigger. Now, again, other traditions understood the unconscious. They understood the shadow. And the shadow means it's an aspect of the unconscious that it relates to the things that we don't feel comfortable identifying ourselves with. That's one way we might put it. So if a classic, and I think a really good example to learn about it, if you watch this movie like it's a body movie, like a buddy movie, then it seems kind of silly and dumb. But if you watch it like it's telling you about your own shadow and it's diagnosing, It's a good movie. It's called Anger Management. And you have to see it has Jack Nicholson in it and Adam Sandler, and you have to see Nicholson as a crazy Zen master. You just have to pretend, okay, he's a crazy Zen master. This is not what I think it is. It's not some stupid movie. And it shows Adam Sandler's character doesn't look like he has an anger management problem. That's because for him, it's too uncomfortable to actually be angry. So he's repressing it, and he's this kind of going along with it dude. And because he won't accept that there's anger in him, then he can't, his life is stuck. And so Nicholson's character gets him to just face, okay, look, I have anger in me. And then it doesn't mean I act on the basis of it, but it won't do to repress it. The shadow then can have things that are sometimes, okay, yeah, anger's a challenging thing, so we don't want to just let that through. But sometimes it's our kindness, our sensuality, our compassion. We feel uncomfortable and we push it down. In this scientific culture, there's all this rationalism. So then we start to push down anything that sounds woo-woo or sounds too, even if it's like we have scientific evidence for it. Alternatively, people love to go rushing to the body. And then the mind and reason get repressed. I'm very intuitive, which means you don't want to be rational. And we don't have to choose. We have to find a balance. And Jung felt beautifully that our soul was always trying to move us toward wholeness, and that what appear as symptoms and even as synchronicities that might be acts of fate, because one of his even more powerful quotes that you might have come across is, when an inner conflict is not made conscious, it appears in the outside world as fate. It looked like that drunk driver just ran that light and hit you. Who could have predicted? But Jung would say, well, where were you when it happened? What were you thinking about? Were you on your way to have an illicit affair? What was happening? Was it the job you don't like? And so the psyche touches everything ultimately for Jung. But the shadow is this at least this part that we will have to deal with when we're pushing away something. We're not accepting reality and not accepting ourselves and not figuring out how to work with what might be challenging.
I love this. And it's something that we talk a lot about, well, we coach folks on as well, but it's digging into those beliefs that we have about ourselves that drive a lot of the actions or behaviors that we take. And maybe where I'd like to go first is one is it's scary to look at those things.
Yes.
And then also there's an initial resistance before we can actually look at some of those beliefs. Do you want to talk about, like, one is how common that is, and maybe how do we sort of start shining a light on the shadow without completely destabilizing people?
Yeah. This is a very tricky question because of the fact that unconscious means unconscious. And there is something about that we're not able to, I think, fully accept. I get this with clients very often where in the midst of a dialogue with them, it's as if they're telling me they don't have an unconscious. And we can be quite sure about all our insights and who I am and all of this. And so the Buddhist tradition gives such a wonderful depiction of this particular aspect because there's it's called a sutra, which is etymologically related to our word for sutures. So it's like a thread of the teaching. And there is a sutra called the Vimalakirti Sutra. And this is just a story about this guy, Vimalakirti, who he's a very special spiritual being, very deeply, deeply realized. And he encountered the people who are around the Buddha kind of would be the equivalent of saints. These are his very top level students. And anybody meeting them would think, oh, they're so enlightened and amazing, and they can meditate and they give the teachings. And so Vimalakirti, what happened is these people started to avoid him, and he knew that they didn't see that their unconscious was blocking them. And so then he manifests an illness, such a powerful thing. He manifests an illness knowing that then Buddha will be concerned about him and will want to come and visit and send people. So he knows all this is going to happen. He manifests this illness, and then all the saints are sitting around, and Buddha says to one of them, Shariputra, will you go and see how Vimalakirti is doing? He's such a dedicated student of reality, of philosophy. And Shariputra says, yeah, I don't really want to go. Why not? Okay, well, this one time I was meditating, and Vimalakirti came along, and he basically told me that I was doing it wrong. You know, and I didn't know what to say to him. But the thing is that other people were listening to him explain the nature of meditation, and they all became very they had insights and transformations. And so I just left. I didn't know what to do. And he goes to each person, and each one had a thing. Well, I was begging for food, and Vimalakirti said, you're doing it wrong. This text is trying to say to us in a very direct and imagistic way, these people were revered by others. They themselves thought they were so enlightened. And somebody else noticed that they weren't. There was something still in the shadow that they couldn't see that was blocking them. And so we have to first be willing to say, okay, maybe I'm ignorant. Maybe there are things that I don't know about myself and that I can't see. Now, then you ask what happens? There is a part of us that's afraid. That's part of why we don't want to look at it. And it's so important to recognize that some part of us is legitimately, in a sense, afraid, because if we were to try to force the revelation, we might have a psychotic break, and this happens. People have bad trips with psychedelics, right? Or they get traumatized or re-traumatized. All kinds of things can go sideways. Similarly, people can go on a spiritual retreat and end up with a psychotic break. Mm-hmm. You cannot force yourself. So you need training, teaching. And when you were talking about the beliefs, examining beliefs, that's one of the things that a preliminary philosophical education would do. And it does it a little bit, you could say, it does it in a different way than sometimes we have in the culture, because it doesn't just try to find the beliefs and then say, well, analyze the belief and say, well, is it really true? How do I feel when it's true? How would I feel if I didn't believe that? But it's also trying to give you some more skillful sense of reality. A contingent belief, you could say, that is considered a vitalizing one, if you're careful with it. And so you have belief like, well, I believe everything really is interwoven. It really is interwoven. I believe that I really do have the potential to become wise and loving and graceful, a beautiful being. And you start to have some faith because the wisdom traditions show you exemplars of realized beings. And those teachings that's part of what then gives you the strength to turn toward things, because you start to say, well, wait, I make these things with my mind. You learn about the mind. The other thing that it can be really helpful is to learn compassion. That's absolutely essential. I wouldn't teach anything without compassion as the foundation, because what compassion does too is it gives you verify your capacity to turn toward whatever is arising. No matter how difficult it may seem, compassion shows you that you can turn toward it. And it gives you a medicine for when things get overwhelming. And it too does not mean forcing it, because sometimes the compassionate thing is to say, I can't do this. I can't do this medicine right now, or I can't go on. Whatever it is, I need to go take a walk. Fine. That's about discernment and compassion. So yes, fear is a major thing. It's part of then why we pretend there isn't an unconscious and avoid it, but it's okay. It's legitimate in the sense we need the education to teach us that we can become more than we are.
Yeah, absolutely. And just want to echo the not pushing it. I know this was me, but I really wanted to push into anything that would make me feel better as fast as possible, because that's one of my high achieving parts. And yeah, I think, well, one was it slowed me down ultimately, but also there's an element of like you hit a limit and you just shut down. And so I know a lot of our audience are similar to me in a sense that there are these high achieving folks, and it's something that we just have to be aware of, because depending on who our coach or therapist is or guide, they might not have seen folks that do this too. Because I know my therapist had never seen someone with trauma that was like driving really hard. And so it's just something for you to be aware of on your journey.
Indeed. Thank you for saying that. It's really important. And these are deep, deep questions. You know, it's okay to have a drive to for something good that seems at least good to you. But we have to reflect carefully on, well, do I have the right aim? Is that the right aim for me? And do I really know how to get there in a way that is not going to create negative side effects for myself and others? And do I have mistaken beliefs? Because, of course, the main thing the culture seduces us into thinking is that when I get success, I'll be happy. And the wisdom traditions say, no, that's not at all correct, and certainly not the way you think. So, yeah, we need a big shift in how we think about these things, and that's a part of the unconscious. We think we're walking around with our own ideas, and I know what I want, but the culture has shaped you. And there are things that you can't even know that you would want because they're not here. They're not available. There's no example of it. So then how would we even determine what's possible for us if we haven't seen it? You know, a lot of times we're treating somebody like they're Einstein, but they're just the high school physics teacher. But because we've got no exposure to I've never seen physics like this. Meanwhile, this is just a run-of-the-mill, high school teacher. But we think that because we never met Einstein and we never saw, this is the way that you could see reality and think about it and so on. People said that about Richard Feynman, that it was just, his sister talked about that she said, I just never met anybody who just had it in them the way he did. He experienced this stuff and he showed people a different way to do physics. And it was joyful. That was what really guided him, just like Buddha, who was a great philosopher for that reason, too. He was guided by joy, true joy.
Yeah, and totally recommend watching the Feynman lectures if you're getting into physics. They're an incredible series. But I want to, Nikos, I'd love to go back. You mentioned that a lot of folks believe that success will make them happy. And I know I started there, and I know a lot of our audience are on various degrees of this. Like, what do we ultimately learn on this journey? And I suppose, what would we want folks to take away that would support them, that maybe questioning that belief, or what should they be shooting for?
Oh, yeah, man. And what's so funny is how seemingly obvious it is in a sense. It's as if we reflected a little bit, we would realize this. And Adam Smith, Captain Capitalism, is really clear. He writes this directly, that we cannot become happy from any material gain. The marketplace will never provide us what will make us happy. The only way to be happy and at peace and fulfilled is following the path of wisdom and virtue. And then, unfortunately, he says, well, but, we should, have this other path, and that should be what the culture is based on. It's
But you can
almost
buy
ridiculous.
wisdom and virtue.
Yeah, well, he even admits that you couldn't buy him. That's part of it. He's almost schizophrenic. I feel like he's like a divided soul. He knows these wisdom traditions, and what he says is what, in your own way, you might have experienced. He says, "Look, the thing is that we all know this, although sometimes it takes a brush with death," is what he describes it. Like if you got really sick, which back in the 1700s, if you got a severe flu, you didn't know if you were going to die. And so he said, if you get really sick and you don't know if you're going to make it, you'll suddenly say, "What am I doing? None of this matters. What have I done to myself?" But then he says, "You'll come back. You'll be back. You'll be back on the bandwagon, back on the bottle, so to speak. It's fine to have that moment of clarity." But he just thought you'd get sucked back into it. But that's again because the culture's not resourcing that. If you don't have a culture rooted in wisdom, love, and beauty, then you're going to be deluded like this. And then what we see are the ecological consequences. Like if there's any question, Earth absorbs human ignorance as much as she can. And we are seeing all the evidence that she's done. And so the consequences, there is no act of ignorance that goes unpunished, let's say. The consequences appear in our bodies. but they also appear in the world, and they appear in other people's bodies. Because if you're the one pushing for more extraction and more pollution, somebody else's body is going to have that pollution in it too. And maybe more than you do, because they're closer to the source or whatever it might be. You're not off the hook, because you won't be happy. There's plenty of people with lots of wealth and power who are unhappy. And so we see this again and again. And Smith just thought he thought, look, if you consult your own experience, look at people, look at history, think of kings, think of stories, you find time and time again that these things that we're chasing won't make us happy. So, he just kind of was hoping maybe for the best. Instead of saying, no, you got to take a stand for wisdom and love and beauty and ask yourself, what do I really value? What's actually important, really? If I were on my deathbed, what would I wish people would think I had lived for? And the research is interesting. I got a thing coming out soon. I wrote a couple pieces on it, but I don't have a podcast on, about this big Harvard study. I mean, they ran this thing since 1938. And several books have been written on it. The last book was by George Valent, who was running it at the time. And he summarized the whole thing. He said, look, you want me to summarize $20 million, 75 years at that time of research. Here's our finding. Happiness is love, full stop. Well, that's not in the marketplace. That's against the marketplace. I mean, you can't find love in there. We all know that. And what's amazing is that he in the data, and the wisdom tradition is completely unsurprised by this, but in the data, what he shows is the Harvard study, for those of you who don't know, they took 3 Harvard classes. Now, they expanded it because, of course, that would have been mainly white males. All well and good. These are interesting people in a way. One of them was JFK. So you have people who are going to become movers and shakers in the society. Well, let's trace them over their whole life. And they found such remarkable things that you could have 2 people, here, 2 guys, they both went to Harvard, both roughly the same IQ. Everything's roughly the same, so they have equal capacity. Now, one guy makes twice as much as the other guy. Why is that? One factor, warmth of childhood.
Trauma, yeah.
Yeah. If you had a cold childhood versus a warm childhood, it followed you your whole life. So that love made you capable of the things that you achieved. It's not even that you achieved it. I don't want to take it away from you. It's not like that. But we think it's called the fundamental attribution error. We locate the cause of everything in me. But no, my mother made me. My father made me. And the relationship with mother and father then affects my income. It even affects dementia risk. It affects all sorts of things. Now, there are, of course, exceptions and so on. But what they were saying is, talent is not sufficient. Hard work is not sufficient to make you successful. They're not even necessary to make you successful. Moreover, conventional success isn't success. That's what that study finds, because some of these people, who was happy? Well, one guy might have given up his dream to be, some big attorney, and instead became a high school teacher and raised his kids. But he had love in his life, and he was more happy and felt more successful than the guy who did pursue the wealth. And so they're saying that conventional success isn't going to make you happy anyway. But hey, if you want it, love is still the key. And raising your kids with love is still the best thing you could do if you want them to do well in the world. And so the message is, you could be happy within the matrix, but then they needed to just emphasize, but maybe we should all get out of the matrix. And that's what the wisdom traditions would say. So yeah, sure. If you at least put some love in the matrix, it's better, but get out of the matrix and the love just flows. And then it's a better world for everybody.
So where did we go wrong? Because we talked about it, right? As like a lot of the wisdom traditions have already figured all this stuff out. Mm-hmm. And now it's definitely not part of our psyche, I suppose, in the world today. Like, where did we lose out on that wisdom?
Well, conquest consciousness seizes us. And so it's old in a way. You could say, if you had a culture that was rooted in wisdom, love, and beauty, then philosophy would just be how we do things. And there wouldn't be philosophers. There would be elders, medicine men, or shamans, and those would be the main people. Elders of various kinds too. You're the person who was maybe the main storyteller, or one of the main storytellers. The elder in that tradition would have a gravitas. People would respect them and the way they told the story. Everything about it which story they chose. All the details would be there because they were the philosopher. They understood those stories so intimately. And the culture would be more rooted that way. So it was, you didn't have to have, in other words, what we had in the conquest cultures, which is a reaction against the conquest. Somebody like Socrates standing up and saying, wait a second, we think we're such a big deal, conquering everybody. We got all the, no, we're going to pot because this culture is filled with ignorance. And people they can't see that. And so Socrates' culture was locked into the same thing we are today. You know, there were people who were thought leaders, business leaders, and so on. They knew what was right. And when Socrates would question them, he would find out they were actually ignorant. They didn't even know their own domain. And that's in part also, it reflected in that study that, look, once you get over an IQ of about 110, which is only one standard deviation, there's no difference. IQ doesn't do anything. So you don't have to be smarter. You don't even necessarily know why it's working, because it's not like, any of these people said, well, the reason I made $250,000 and this other guy didn't is because my mom was nice to me. None of them knew that. What they said is I worked hard. And meanwhile, the guy who made half as much might have been working twice as hard. And so the formal thing that we call philosophy, like once it starts to get separated, it's because it's already now a fish swimming upstream. It's the salmon of wisdom going against the current of the culture. And so that means that only some people are going to respond. We have to ask, well, how can we get more people to listen to wisdom? The level of distress in the world seems to be calling people. Maybe even some of the plant medicines are calling people, like the fungi are actually calling. I know that sounds weird. Look, I was started out in philosophy of science. I'm a very careful person about these sorts of things, but everything is interwoven. And anybody who's experienced synchronicities and really touched the magic of the world knows that no, our science, we even have plenty of evidence for these things. And I don't think it's that weird to say that the world is calling us to wake up. So maybe there's a chance that we could listen. The dominant culture thought of having a rebirth in wisdom, love, and beauty, and we called it the Renaissance. Sometimes we think, oh yeah, the Renaissance, the rebirth of what? They were very conscientious that the Greek tradition had been preserved in the Byzantine Empire by Greeks there, but also by Arabic culture. And they're very beautiful streams in Arabic culture. We get all this Islamophobia, but they preserved the tradition of wisdom. They had sages in the Muslim tradition. It's like as if it's a shock to us, and there still are. But the Arabic world and the Greek world had preserved it. The Greeks, when Constantinople fell, they moved to Europe, and they brought Aristotle and Plato, and the Europeans said, "What's this?" Well, here, look, these guys are geniuses, and they recognized it, and they wanted to. There were people who wanted to aspire to that again. They saw Socrates as an ideal. They saw Plato and Aristotle as real geniuses, and they thought, yeah, we should aspire to that. But we didn't. There was not a Renaissance. There was the invention of science, because knowledge is easier than wisdom. It's much easier to kill a bird, cut it open, and say, I know it, than it is to live well with that bird and listen to what it teaches you. Listen to the voice of the sacred coming through that bird. That's more challenging. Wisdom is a little harder, but then the scientist gets let off the hook. They can be any old kind of person. I mean, you can be any old jerk, but if the microscope has the cells in it, you can count them. And Socrates didn't. The wisdom traditions really object to this view. Science, as we have it, was happy to abandon wisdom because it did not recognize what it later found out, that knowledge depends on the way you come to know. Science in its birth just treated like knowledge is out there and we'll figure it out and we know how to do it. We chop things up, we kill them, we look at them, and we bang them together. And the wisdom traditions have always said, no, the world will only yield to you the insights that you have made yourself ready for through practicing your life. If you become the right kind of person, then a knowledge can come to you that could heal you and your culture. It could help you cultivate the whole of life onward. But we lost that, and we have to recover it as part of the problem with our science. But that's a radical thing, that knowledge depends on my way of knowing, and that means it depends on what I am. As I make myself into the kind of person who could know more profound things, then they come, and not before.
Ooh, I love this. And you mentioned about the bird is learning to live with the bird. When you talked on the top of the show about you learning more from a horse in 20 minutes, can you tell us, like, what did you learn and how was that experience?
It was experienced in just being together with that Mustang, and that Mustang's ability to convey what, in your context, I would say, to convey what it would mean to be a real leader, and his ability to directly convey it. That you and I share the same nature of mind. And if you and I become, for a moment, attuned to the sacred, then we are both standing in the same space of freedom, in the same space of insight. And what the horse did as a medial figure, again, is invited me to come enter the space where we're both in the space of the sacred. We're both in the space of true freedom, true happiness, true peace. And then the insight is there. And the insight is so precise that language becomes challenging. It doesn't mean that it's ineffable in the sense that, but its experience is always more precise than our concepts. But what were some of the concepts that he was really teaching me? He was teaching me groundedness, presence, the interwovenness of all things, the nature of the mind that he and I share. We have different minds, but the nature of mind, same. And that when our minds are in tune, we are liberated into a larger ecology of mind, which give birth to all the insights and creativity and healing that we need. It's a big shift, and it was really powerful teaching. Very important teacher for, just one encounter. And we had a special connection. So it was just very fortunate.
It's incredible. And I suppose that gets us back to the collective consciousness or unconsciousness. Like, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's one of Jung's maybe most important discoveries. I can certainly say one of his most important. People might argue that it maybe is it his most important. I don't know, but you could imagine that we have cartographies of the soul, maps of the soul. And the ideal map, what it does for us is it teaches us what is the mind and what is the way to liberation. Beautiful, beautiful maps are the mandalas of the Indo-Tibetan tradition. And they have really, really elaborated how to work with these blueprints of the mind. And because their psychology is so sophisticated, there's nothing really comparable in the dominant culture. We're catching up. But so there was almost this weird narrowed cartography because Descartes is, I know people like to pick on him, but he was a bit of a goof, and I know he was a nice guy and he was struggling in his life, but he kind of reduced us to the ego. So the map of the soul is the I. And in part, as a corrective, Jung, or I would say Freud first, Freud comes along and he says, okay, but that thing that you say is I, that's the tip of an iceberg. And then he shows us this, imagine zooming out and saying, this is actually your psyche. And all this stuff is under that I. Because Descartes was talking about clear and distinct ideas, and Freud was saying, you can't see any of this. And it's bigger than that little thing. Whoa, that is a vastly expanded cartography when we really respect it and when we see that the unconscious does influence our lives, does all the time. I mean, one of the most interesting fMRI studies was done. There was an old study done by Benjamin Libet that people still know about because there was a lot of press around it, where he had people, they were watching like a little special clock that would move around, and they were just had one task: decide when you're going to press this button, and just note where the clock hand is. It's just a special timer, and just note when it is when you made the decision, because we know it will take you maybe a second to move your finger. But when you think now, then tell us where it was. And what they found was that half a second before that, there was a what's called an evoked potential. There was a spike in the neurons in the brain, saying that the brain knew before the person. And there was all this debate, oh, it's only half a second, and what does it mean, and so on. Well, there was argument, but then years later, once we got fMRI scanners, they put people into a brain scanner, and they said, let's do the same thing. And so now, if you didn't know what was going on, and you got the data back, because it's too complex to do in real time, but you get the data, and you are supposed to guess, when is that person going to press the button? You would know as much as 10 seconds before the person claimed that they had made their decision. So you're standing there thinking, wow, this human in 10 seconds is going to think that she made a decision to press a button. But she didn't. She made it now. Or they didn't. They made it now. And this is like mind-boggling, but that's part of the evidence that Freud was right. But something under there's more to it than you think. And then Jung comes along, though, and he says, well, I really like this iceberg, and he did work to try to verify it, and that's how they met. He read Freud and said, I think I'm verifying this repression mechanism. But then he said, but you see the icebergs floating in the ocean, that's part of the psyche. And Freud was, wait a second, man, because that means that the psyche is not merely personal, but it is profound, has a profound impersonal dimension to it. You could say it's the non-duality of the personal and the impersonal ultimately, but this thing that is not personal and is shared by all of us. And a simple example would be that, and it's maybe too simple, don't dismiss it, but there's not a culture where a circle means fragmentation. Circle means wholeness, and we have medicine wheels and mandalas and spirit circles. The circle appears again and again and again. And, if I were an anthropologist from Mars, I might say, why? And we think it makes sense. Well, because it's wholeness. But why is that the symbol for wholeness? And we think it's so obvious. And Jung was saying, well, there's a lot more to it than that. The butterfly is an archetypal. That's an image. And the butterfly, it means transformation all over the world. You can find it cross-culturally. And but that resonates with us in a way that is not just like, oh, yeah, it's a butterfly, it changed from a cat. It's not like that. It's more powerful. So he felt that these were instincts of the psyche, the same way that we know of instincts of the body, or at least we try to talk about instincts. Like when you throw a baby into water, there's a diving instinct, right? And they won't drown. They'll hold their breath. There's a diving instinct there. And the same thing is true in the psyche. Okay, so the collective unconscious, then, is this profound suggestion that there is an objective psyche. There's something about our psyche that is shared across cultures. And that's a profound thing, It is to say, and what's interesting, too, is how that relates then with any reasonable, rational understanding of what magic is, because magic relies on those symbols that would activate this collective unconscious. Okay. I think those are some general thoughts. I don't know if that's enough of an answer for now.